Hello and welcome to the Progressive Hub Show. My name is Ryan Black. With me today is Charles Glass, author of Soldiers Don't Go Mad, a story of brotherhood, poetry, and mental illness during the First World War. Soldiers Don't Go Mad examines the huge scale of PTSD during World War I and how at least one hospital was innovative in treating what was called shell shock at the time, even if the end goal was to get treated soldiers back onto the front lines to continue the war. It follows two of England's most well-known poets of World War I, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who met at Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Scotland in 1917, as well as the physicians who cared for them and others. Charles, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. You've written previously a lot about World War II and wars in the Middle East. What brought you to World War I and PTSD specifically, or shell shock as it was called at the time?
But I had written a book some years ago called Deserters, which was about the American and British soldiers who deserted from the army in the Second World War. And many of them had deserted because they had nervous breakdowns. In the Second World War, it was called battle fatigue. So I was already interested in the subject of military psychiatry and the mental effects of war on fighting men. I then read an article in the Independent newspaper in London that mentioned Craig Lockhart War Hospital for Officers in Scotland, which was founded in October of 1916 to treat officers who had been shell-shocked at the front in France and Belgium. And I had never heard of Craig Lockhart, and I was interested to know more about it, and I began to do a bit of research. I then read Pat Barker's brilliant Regeneration trilogy, which is a series of 3 novels set in the First World War at Craig Lockhart. And I discovered that no one has ever written a nonfiction account about what actually happened there. Hers is a brilliant fictional account, but it was time, I thought, to bring to the public the facts of this hospital and what was learned there, and the poetry that came out of there, and the treatments that came out of there, and the excellent psychiatric care that was available.
Interesting. I guess in terms of World War I, was that uniquely traumatic for the soldiers and officers? It seems that World War I kind of marked a new way that wars were being fought. Was there anything unique about World War I that added to the trauma?
Some soldiers had broken down in all wars, I mean, going back to what we know of the Trojan War. And certainly in the American Civil War, and quite a few men suffered from nervous breakdowns. The psychiatrist or the doctors at the time called it windage. The theory was that bullets speeding past their brains, but not actually wounding them physically, had somehow disrupted their spinal cords, and that caused their nervous reaction. In some cases, that was actually true. But in the First World War, we had the first industrial war where modern weapons came into play. So this would be high velocity artillery shells of power unheard of in previous wars, machine guns, rapid fire machine guns, living in trenches, chemical weapons, the daily grind of being stuck underground, unable to move while being pounded by high explosive artillery shells, and occasionally going into no man's land on massive offensives in which men were cut down in their thousands. History did not have anything like this before, and many men were wounded and killed. And then the hospitals discovered that a lot of men were showing up in their hundreds and then in their thousands with no physical wounds at all, no bullet wounds, no shrapnel, but were nervous wrecks. They were physically paralyzed, they were blind, they were deaf, they were mute, they were unable to speak, they were just in shock. And in order to treat it, they had to establish new hospitals because there weren't enough hospitals in Britain, or indeed in any of the belligerent countries, to treat all those men. And so Craig Lockhart was one of the first established specifically for the purpose of treating officers for shell shock.
Right. And it seems treatment in general was brand new for this supposed new phenomena, shell shock, even though we know it's happened forever before that, in all years, there was a big question of punishment versus treatment, it seems. And the senior officers mistook shell shock for cowardice. There were, what you wrote, 300 shell shocked men were executed for cowardice by Britain during World War I. Is there any sense of regret about that? Is that talked about? Is that well known? Or is that some kind of buried factoid that no one really wants to bring up anymore?
Well, many, many years later, largely through the efforts of the families of the men who were executed, the British government apologized and took away their dishonorable discharges and exonerated all of them. And there are even monuments to them. They were men who were not necessarily cowards, but they simply broke down. And a lot of the officers, senior officers, didn't believe that there was such a phenomenon. Even many of the military doctors did not believe in it. Even to the end of the war, many of the doctors who were treating them thought they were faking, and they looked down on them and thought that they were cowards and worthless people, and didn't treat them very well at all. In some of the hospitals, they were given electroshock therapy, cold baths, forced to rest for days on end doing nothing, becoming more and more lethargic. But some of the doctors who had studied in Germany, like Dr. William Hulse Rivers and Dr. Arthur Brock at Craig Lockhart, and had studied Freud, understood the basic causes of those symptoms that the doctors observed, and that they were not fake symptoms; they were genuine symptoms of a serious trauma.
Right, and we'll get into the therapies in just one moment. Um, what I remember is that only the ranking officers were usually getting the appropriate type of treatment for PTSD, for shell shock. And it seemed that most of the lower ranking soldiers were getting the electroshock and the old school forms of treatment. So I guess the question is, how many British soldiers, outside of just the officers who were getting some sort of mental health treatment, how many British soldiers during World War I would you estimate actually probably needed this PTSD therapy and didn't get it, or got the wrong type of therapy? I imagine it's huge numbers.
First of all, officers and men were treated separately in separate institutions.
Right.
And some of the institutions that treated the enlisted men were very good, and some were not. And some of the hospitals for officers were not very good. It wasn't just that they were giving special consideration to officers as opposed to enlisted men. They were both were getting treatment, but it all depended on the therapies available in the given institutions and the viewpoints of the psychiatrists in those institutions. The psychiatrists who genuinely believed these men were suffering real trauma treated them accordingly, and those who thought they were cowards and simply needed to get over their symptoms and be slapped around and sent back to the front behaved in that way. It wasn't just a division between officers and men. It was really a division between the types of psychiatry that were being practiced in the different institutions.
So the military, then, it sounds like, was open to the experimentation of whatever works. Their main concern was just getting soldiers back to the front lines. Then they didn't really care. They weren't prescriptive in how the psychiatrists handled people then.
They weren't prescriptive in how the psychiatrist handled it, but as I said in my book, Craig Lockhart was always under suspicion for being too easy on these shell shock cases. That the commandant, Major Bryce, who was also a psychiatrist, let the men lounge around in pajamas during the day and didn't have to appear in military parade every afternoon and didn't enforce military discipline. He said, "This is a hospital, not a military base." And the senior command investigated the hospital 3 times and changed commandant 3 times because many of the senior officers simply didn't approve of that kind of thing. They thought it wasn't military. But Craig Lockhart's psychiatrist went on treating them as patients, not just as soldiers. But the overall purpose of all the hospitals was to get, it's like a repair shop for tanks and trucks, to repair them and get them back to the front where they were needed. So many men had broken down that the numbers at the front were not sufficient to fight the war.
Right, and I imagine the mistrust of these new types of treatment combined with that, some of the psychiatrists had, like you said earlier, history or had been educated in Germany or by Germans or had followed the German line of thinking for this stuff. That probably didn't help in terms of thinking they were not sufficiently patriotic enough, that they were being lazy, that they were fakers or whatever. That probably all worked together to make them be investigated there 3 times, right?
Anti-German prejudice was certainly a factor. Many of the military officers and military psychiatrists looked down on Freud simply because he was Austrian, and Austria was fighting on the side of Germany. But that was a mistake, and the psychiatrist at Craig Lockhart discounted that kind of thinking entirely.
Right. So back to the actual therapies that were attempted there. As we know today, as in forever, no therapy is 100% effective. Nothing has a 100% success rate. But there were lots of therapies that were tried there. Electroshock therapy, which they used to treat symptoms. There were some doctors who just used verbal abuse. Counter suggestion. I'm not sure. What is counter suggestion?
I don't know.
Okay. That was another one that was just another type of therapy, but I think it was just very overtly negative, that kind of negative stuff. But then at Craig Lockhart, you had the talking therapy, which is still obviously used today. What I really found interesting and I really liked was the civic engagement that I forget which doctor it was, but one of them was really, really into pushing civic engagement, golf, music, cricket, tennis, theater, debates, and then the Hydra magazine, which we'll get to in a little bit. Were these the first attempts at using this type of therapy on a large scale?
The main proponent of that, it was called ergotherapy, work therapy, was Dr. Arthur Brock, who was, in addition to being a neurologist and a psychiatrist, was a sociologist. He was a student of Patrick Geddes, the leading Scottish sociologist of his time, sociologist and town planner. And it was his theory that these men had been severed from their environment, severed from their community, and that they had to re-engage with other people, with the community, mainly through work, by working together with other men. So that meant putting out the publication, the fortnightly publication, the Hydra, which was the magazine of the hospital, that included jokes and poems and short stories and reports on the activities of the officers during the daily lives at the hospital. And Brock also encouraged them to explore Edinburgh, the nearest city, where they could understand their place in that city, and also to explore the countryside and understand their place in nature. It was his firm belief that by re-engaging, they became whole again. Dr. Rivers didn't subscribe to it, he didn't discount it, but he mainly indulged in the talking therapy, plain, straightforward Freudian talking therapy, listening to men, understanding their dreams, using hypnotism to probe more deeply into their war experiences and having them confront those experiences in order to dissolve their fear of them.
Gotcha. Do you think the civic engagement end of the therapy was effective and is something that should be utilized more? Is that something that continues to be used today?
It is used today, of course, and it was especially effective in the case of Wilfred Owen, who arrived more or less paralyzed, stuttering, unable to move coherently. Gradually, through the Hydra, which he became the editor of, and by studying German, he took German classes and then got a German tutor in order, he thought, after the war, to try and repair relations between Britain and Germany. He spent time with the art world in Edinburgh, got to know bohemian artists and families with whom he became very close. And he even went to the Royal Astronomer of Scotland to help to study the stars and to understand those things better. So by using his mind and his energies in a constructive way, he was able to be healed to the extent that he was pronounced fit and able to go back to the war.
Right. And his story is so, my son's name is Owen. So it was always, every time something happened to him, I was like, he doesn't make it back home. his family, that's Owen, right? His family finds out he dies on Armistice Day.
No, he died 4 days before. They found out on Armistice Day. He died 4 days before, but they received the telegram on Armistice Day.
I think the most shocking thing to me about this whole book is that they go back to the front lines. That Wilfred Owen went back to the front lines, so he was in war. He wrote all this beautiful poetry about it. He went through all this therapy, but then he still went back and still felt that he had a duty. He was torn about it, it seemed, and he still had this duty. Can you touch on that a little bit about like the how he was torn two different ways?
Well, Owen had an interest in, one, proving he was not a coward. He was afraid that other officers thought he was a coward, and that's why he wasn't at the front. That's why he broke down, and he wanted to prove he wasn't a coward. So he very much wanted to go back to the war to prove that he wasn't a coward. But he also felt, and he learned a lot of this from Siegfried Sassoon, who felt it very strongly, that an officer had a duty to the men, to care for them, to make sure that they were all right, and that their lives were not needlessly wasted, and that they had the full support of their officers who would be at the front lines with them, suffering everything that they suffered. So he went back, and he was so brave, he won the Military Cross. It wasn't actually presented to his family until after he died, but he didn't know he'd won it, but he knew he was up for it. And he was, that for him was a vindication that he wasn't a coward. But in his last day in battle, he was leading a charge across a canal into the face of German machine guns through the water, helping his men across, move forward. Come on, boys, we can do it. We'll get there. Yeah. And then he was cut down by German machine gun fire and died.
I just can't even imagine. I mean, I understand the idea of feeling like a coward. It reminds me of the book, The Things They Carried. And one of the things in there is that what's more courage? What takes more courage? Going to a war that you'll probably die in, or turning your back on the patriotism in the public that wants you to go do it so bad? What actually takes more courage? And I just find that interesting in war stories that obviously Wilfred Owen was very courageous. Obviously he did a lot. And I think it's interesting, the idea of going back really because you have a duty to your men. That's a strong pull. I totally get that. But you have a lot of these war stories where it's men having to deal with what it means to be courageous. And it's not always courageous to stand up to the government. I don't know.
The most decorated American soldier in World War II was Audie Murphy, who won the Medal of Honor more than once, Silver Star, every decoration you could get. He was widely regarded as the hero of the Second World War. He was in the Texas Division, and he fought in France. But he wrote in his autobiography, I was forced to be brave because I was afraid of being thought a coward.
That's the point I see in all of these books about soldiers that I find so interesting. It's a lot of men dealing with courage and what's it in proving themselves to others. It's tough. That's tough. Moving on to more, we'll go back and forth a little bit. I've gone all out of order on my questions. This has been a great conversation so far. I'm trying to think of how I phrase this question. Owen and Sassoon saw a lot of suffering. And through seeing this suffering, it led to them calling out the ridiculousness of the war, writing this beautiful poetry, putting questions out there about, the questions about the strategy of the war and if it should continue to be fought, where's the off ramp? How do we end? And they brought all these beautiful questions up. But that art doesn't exist unless they go to war. So it's an interesting thing. We get a lot of anti-war sentiments and we get a lot of questioning about war from the soldiers themselves, but we wouldn't have that unless we went to the war. So I guess how do we square that where some of the most prominent anti-war voices are oftentimes the people from war? And so we need them to try to push back against war. It's just an interesting dynamic. Do you see the dynamic I'm talking about?
Well, certainly there was a large body of opinion among the soldiers at the front that the public was being lied to about the war, which it was. And that things were much, much worse at the front lines than the public was ever allowed to know. Otherwise, they couldn't get more young men to join the army. And Sassoon tried to blow a great big hole through that. And later, in my lifetime, the Vietnam veterans against the war were the most vocal and the most listened to because they had credibility. People who tried to stop the Vietnam War and tried to bring the troops home, which eventually happened, and they had a huge role in making that
happen. One of the ideas presented in the book is the idea, and you mentioned this earlier a little bit, and I wanted to come back around to it. It's another kind of complicated idea that I'll try to wrap my head around right. It's the idea of where does PTSD come from? And one of the ideas presented in the book and that you touched on was the idea of facing this extreme violence while also being like pinned down, without being able to manipulate your environment, without being able to do much about it, and just having to deal with extreme violence all around you, watching your friends die. Nowadays, we're fighting our wars largely with drones to where we don't even have to declare war on anyone, and which makes the human suffering largely invisible for our own troops. There are no US troops in Ukraine, but we're sending a ton of money and a ton of weapons. There weren't US troops, tons of US troops in Libya or Syria, but there were lots of drones. We know that through the war on terror as well. So I guess the question is, by using drone warfare, we're likely going to reduce the PTSD for American soldiers.
If they don't have to go to the front, they're less likely to be traumatized. However, I've read that many of the young people in the command centers that send the drones to kill people, largely in the Middle East and Afghanistan, have nervous breakdowns because those drones have cameras and they see the families dying, and it can be too much for them. It's murdering people. No one raises his child to murder people.
Right.
And so you're conflicted between what you've been taught all your life that killing is wrong, and then you're killing. And you're not only killing, you're killing without any risk to yourself, and you're watching people die, not just the individual you think is a terrorist, but his whole family. And that cannot help but cause an emotional reaction.
Right. So I guess my thought was, would the use of drone warfare, will removing soldiers from the killing reduce PTSD? Maybe a little, but it seems obviously there's still major issues with that. And I guess the follow-up is that good? And this is maybe a philosophical question here, but without the PTSD of war, do we not get the emotional toll and the stories and the stuff we need to try to stop the war? It's complicated. But is it a good thing to fight wars with just drones away, where we are trying to minimize the PTSD? Obviously wars aren't good anywhere. We want to end all wars if it were up to me. But it seems like drone warfare and the removing soldiers might just prolong wars and cause more suffering in the end.
Well, the war on terror is called the forever war, because it's not a war against a state. No one can surrender. So it can go on and on and on. And the PTSD is mainly suffered not by the people sending the drones, but by the people on the ground.
Right.
Firstly, they're physically wounded, or they're killed, or they're mentally traumatized forever. When a little child in Afghanistan sees his whole family wiped out, of course he'll be traumatized forever. War always induces trauma and death and rape and pillage. There are very few upsides to war.
Right, of course, and ending them as quickly as possible should be the strategy. But we see in World War I, they weren't necessarily trying to end the war as quickly as possible. They didn't want to negotiate and things like that. Similar things we have going on in Ukraine and Russia right now. There's a Sassoon line referenced in the book that's really powerful. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. So there's this feeling that seems to persist then and now of the public cheering soldiers while having no idea what they had to do or what they've gone through or what they see or even what their feelings are about the war. Is this a permanent state of people? Is that the same everywhere? It's the same in World War I everywhere. It's the same in World War II as the Iraq War. Is that pretty much just the script that people follow, that we're always going to cheer our soldiers? Has there ever been a time and place where that didn't happen?
It only happens when you're losing. As long as you think you can win or at least go on fighting without losing, the public will go on supporting the war. And there's a kind of myth that supporting the war means supporting the soldiers, that somehow if you're against the war, you're against your own soldiers. But it's not the case. In fact, for their well-being, it's better to end the war and bring them home. That's how to avoid them being killed and dismembered and mentally traumatized. It's not necessarily patriotic to cheer them into the jaws of death. Just the opposite.
Right. I remember it's every year after 9/11 for I don't even know how many years we had the support our troops American flag in the newspaper every September 11th, and support our troops was the slogan of the post 9/11 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that was to conflate supporting the war with supporting the troops. And I think that's the same thing that media pundits would do. Do you not support our troops? There's a famous Bill Riley on David Letterman, and he says, well, do you not want us to win the war? And he said, well, it's not about winning or losing. Trump had a similar line about this, about Ukraine and Russia. It's not about winning or losing. It's about ending the killing. And, like a broken clock, he's right. And I think David Letterman, when he told Bill O'Reilly, it's not about winning or losing, I think he was right too. But I think that's just so difficult for normal people to grasp onto. And it just feels like an attack on the soldiers, and therefore an attack on the country, and therefore a personal attack on individuals. I don't know how we're going to square that. Do you think that there's a future where being a little more anti-war, questioning wars will become more acceptable?
Well, after what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, in both cases, there are very few people now who say those were good ideas.
Right.
Considering the way that they were both lost. The Taliban is in power in Afghanistan. Iraq suffered 10 years of absolute hell under the American occupation. And America finally had to leave without any great gains. And then if you don't learn from those two wars that it's really a bad idea to invade other countries, then you'll never learn. And I'm not terribly optimistic that people will ever learn. We didn't learn from all the wars of history, and there's no reason to suppose we're going to learn from modern wars either. It seems to be, I hate to say it, part of the human condition.
Yeah, bleak, but at least so far in my life, I was 11 when 9/11 happened, and I'm 33 now, and we've been in wars since then. So it's vast majority of my life. Couple quick last questions. I'm hopping back around on things I missed. I want to talk about the Hydra real quick, which was a publication from Craig Lockhart, War Hospital. You talked about it a little bit ago. How important was that publication? And that's for soldiers to read, for PTSD patients to express themselves. It seemed like it benefited everyone. Was that generally the consensus?
It was an outlet for the patients. They could put into words their feelings and their thoughts about, not just about the war, but about their romances, about what was happening in the hospital, about the absurdities of certain military regulations, making fun of senior officers. There was quite a leeway in what they could publish. There wasn't any censorship of it. The Hydra was also read widely in Edinburgh. It was for sale in bookshops in Edinburgh. So they wanted as well to make a connection to the community in Edinburgh, to have support for those officers who were there. The officers who were there, they had to wear a blue armband to show that they were hospital patients. So when they went into Edinburgh, people would know that they were Craig Lockhart patients. Some people just looked down on them because they thought they were deserters and cowards, and some people were very sympathetic. One of the sad things about going into Edinburgh was that every day at 1:00, something called the 1:00 gun fired from the top of Edinburgh Castle, which was a traditional way of telling ship's captains that it was 1:00 so they could reset their watches. But when the gun went off, it was was a blank charge, but it was very loud. Officers who were in Edinburgh at 1 o'clock would jump into doorways or fall down cowering and shaking again because they thought they were back at the front. It was a terrible thing. And they wrote about that in the Hydra, and the experience of being stared at because they'd broken down in front of men, women, and children in Edinburgh. They were very ashamed of it. It hurt them a lot. But by writing about it in the Hydra and sharing this very common experience with the other officers at Craig Lockhart, it helped them a bit to mend. The other great thing about the Hydra is it is a record of some of the best poetry of the war. Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen published many of their poems in the Hydra, and they were not the only one. Many officers published their poems, but the best were, of course, by Sassoon and Owen.
Sure. Was the Hydra ever censored?
As far as I know, there was no censorship of it, and they were free able to express some very strong anti-war sentiments in the poetry in the Hydra.
That's great. I wish we had a Hydra today in the U.S. for our wars. I don't think the U.S. military would let U.S. soldiers express.
Well, actually, I read Stars and Stripes. There are a lot of criticism in Stars and Stripes.
Are those by active soldiers?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. Great.
I'm proud to say that the editor is a friend of mine, Bob Reed, and I don't think in fact, the Stars and Stripes gave my book an excellent review. Great. They're very sympathetic to the soldiers, much more so than to the high command.
Good.
It is the soldiers' paper.
Good. One last question for you. The poets Sassoon and Wilfred Owen wrote very differently about the war, and I think you summed it up really nicely. Sassoon blamed the country's rulers and its complacent citizenry, while in Owen's poetry, the war appeared as a natural catastrophe beyond human control. Did that dynamic reflect the public's view as well during World War I? And do we see that same dynamic today?
Well, most of the public was jingoistic and in favor of the war, so not really. Okay. Sassoon was furious with the politicians, the senior officers, and the public for supporting this war, no matter how many people got killed. I mean, thousands of people killed every week, even when there wasn't a major offensive, and that they didn't care about the loss of life. In fact, 5,000 was considered a successful, adequate price to pay for a week at the front.
Well, you mentioned at one point in the book when they're, God, I forget the specific line, like nothing important, no news of importance. There was a report where when nothing big happened, but you knew 5,000 soldiers died, and
that was a regular comment in military press releases. It was also on the German side. All quiet on the Western Front, although hundreds of people were dying. And Erich Maria Remarque then wrote his famous novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, about those periods at the front when actually things were happening, people were dying.
But the lines weren't moving, so nothing happened. It's just
when there were major offensives and then tens of thousands of people were killed, then that was worth mentioning that something was happening.
Jeez. All right. Well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an excellent conversation. Can you let people know where they can find your book?
Well, thanks, Ryan. I'm glad you asked. They can get it in any good bookshop and at bookshop.com or barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com. It's available all places, or indeed direct from the publisher, Penguin Press.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Charles Glass, author of Soldiers Don't Go Mad, a story of brotherhood, poetry, and mental illness during the First World War. Excellent book. Strongly suggest you pick it up. And we will talk again another time, Charles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ryan.